My name is Mary Saroki Romaya, and I was born in Detroit, 1944. At the time that I was growing up my best memories are in the late 40s and early 1950s. It was a small community. There were over 100 families, but it wasn't anywhere the size of the community today. And so everybody knew each other, and even if they were not related, we would go to each other's events, like the weddings. Everybody from the community would go to the weddings or to the baptisms or the first communion parties. So it was a very close-knit community. And people usually saw each other at church on Sundays, but even the children, we would play together with our cousins, or even if they weren't our cousins, if they were other Chaldeans, we would play with them. We did not have a Chaldean priest here until February of 1947. So the earliest Chaldeans who were born in the Detroit area were baptized, including myself, at St. Maron's Lebanese Maronite Church. We were baptized in the Maronite rite of the Catholic Church because there wasn't a Chaldean priest here. And so St. Maron's is in Detroit. It still exists. It was built around 1916, and we didn't get our first church, Chaldean church, until 1947. And so I was baptized in a Maronite church. My father came in 1929, and he came with his nephew. My dad was Yelda Saroki, and he came with his nephew, Moidorga Diku. And when they came to America, they just sort of took more American names, but they came in 1929. And I remember saying to May of 29, and I remember one time asking my dad, how did you come during the year of the Great Depression? He said, how did I know there was going to be a Great Depression? Because that wasn't until October of 1929. So my dad took the name, it's Yelda's Anton Saroki, but he wanted a more American name, like working in the store, so he took the name Joe. And he said his name was Joe Anton, but it was really Yelda Anton Saroki. And his nephew, Moidorga Diku, they called him Roy Thomas because his middle name was Thomas. So they had more American sounding names. And my father and his nephew, who were more like brothers because there's only 6 months difference in age, although it's uncle to nephew, came to America and worked in a Chaldean store. It was actually the store of my father's brother-in-law, a gentleman, I can't remember, Petrus Merrim. And they worked at the store, and after a few years of making some money, my dad and Moidorga Diku went back to Telkeppe, which is where they were from. And their intention, I think, originally was make some money in America, go back to the village, and just live a good life. And they were farmers from the village. And they married, my dad met my mother, or somebody picked out him as his wife, picked out my mother for my dad. And they were married in January of 1936. My dad and Moidorga decided to come back to America, and sometimes when I've given presentations about the Chaldeans, I mentioned the World War I song about how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris. After the American soldiers had gone to Europe during World War I, and a lot of them were farm boys from Idaho or Nebraska or Kansas. And after seeing the big cities in Europe, when they came back to America after the war, they didn't want to necessarily live on the farms anymore. So my dad and Moidorga came back to America probably about later 1936 or 1937. Got a store again, started a business, bought a house, and then they sent for their wives. And so I had asked my mother when my dad, Baba, left and came back to America, what did you do? And she said, I just went back home to my parents. I mean, she had a father and a stepmother. Her own mother had died when my mother was 9. Her, what would be my grandmother, well, she is my grandmother, but I never knew her, died giving birth to another child. And so, anyways, my mom and Madorga's wife, Shamanta, came to America in December of 1937. And then about 9 months later, my oldest sister was born. And so there was actually several Chaldeans. This is not a unique story. There were other families where the men had come, left their wives in Iraq, came back to the U.S., started a business, got a home, and then sent for their wives. And maybe they may have had very young children or no children, but when the wives came to America and the families were husbands and wives were reunited, there was a small baby boom in the 1938, 1939, 1940, in the early 1940s. There was a whole group of American-born Chaldean children from the pioneer immigrants. And we say pioneer referring to any immigrant who had come to the U.S. and stayed and made the U.S. their home before the start of World War II. And so my parents were not the first immigrants here. There were people in the teens, there were major men here like by 1910, 1912. And more people came in the 1920s. But my father, 1929, my mother, 1937. I'm the third of 5 children. I have 2 older sisters. I was the third daughter with no son in the family yet. And then 2 brothers were born after me. I have a brother 9 years younger than me and another brother about 12 and a half years younger than me. And I think like many immigrant families, our name was changed. Like when my 2 sisters and I were born, on my birth certificate, it says that my father is Joe Anton, though he's really Yelda Saroki. And that's true of my 2 older sisters. Then my father became a U.S. citizen. And when he became a U.S. citizen, they said, okay, what legally is your name? And he said, Yelda Anton Saroki. And that's his name, that is his real name, and that's his name on his citizenship papers. And then my 2 brothers were born. So on their birth certificates, my father is listed as Yelda Saroki. And so 3 girls were born, had one last name, and my 2 brothers had a different last name, even though we're the same family, same set of parents. And I don't think this is unusual with immigrant families. Names get changed. The Georges, like Mike George and his family, their real last name is Lucia. Madorga Diku, who my dad's nephew, his sons were originally, last name was Thomas, but because they were both, anyways, they changed when Madorga became a citizen. He went back to his real name of Madorga Diku, no longer using Roy Thomas. So the boys' names were legally changed from Thomas to Diku. But I think this is fairly common with immigrant families. But I remember one time being in upper elementary school, and my brother was maybe in the 1st grade, and I was like maybe in the 8th grade or, anyways, I remember a nun asking me, so your mother was a widow and then remarried? And I said, what? And she said, so your father must have died and your mother remarried. And I'm thinking, what is she talking about? And I said, I really don't understand you. I said, Roger and Victor are my brothers. And she said, well, why do you have different last names? And I said, I don't know. I mean, I didn't know because it was not an uncommon story in the early pioneer Chaldean community. It was, I mean, I never really thought about it. A lot of people had different names. You know, they were called Suad and they became Sue. They were called Hannah and they became John. When I was growing up as a child, I mean, I knew I was Chaldean, but I was just growing up within the Chaldean community. Everybody was the same. The difficulty sometimes, I think, sort of began when I was like a teenager or in high school. Like, you want to go to your prom, but your parents don't want you to date non-Chaldeans. And I'm thinking, I just want to go to the prom. And no, you can't, or who you going to go with, or can I go away to college? Absolutely not. You know, can I go to college? Yes, but 2 miles away at the University of Detroit. So, I mean, my 2 older sisters and I did go to college, which was unique for our time. I mean, there were only maybe 1 or 2 others. Julie Nager Hallahan went to college, but very few. None of my friends at my actual group went to college at the time that I went. But my parents both did value in education, because my dad had been a little bit better educated from men from Telkeppe, because for high school he actually went to Mosul, and he did go to high school, which I don't think was typical of some of the men born in Telkeppe in his generation. My dad was born in 1910. But we were allowed to go to college, but we did go to the University of Detroit, a Jesuit school. I know a lot of the Chaldeans who grew up in Baghdad are very proud of having gone to Baghdad College and Al-Hikmah, which were Jesuit run high school and the universities. But there was a group of us, American born or American raised, who also had a Jesuit education. And so went to college, and and even in college, it was like, yes, you can go to college, but you become a teacher or a nurse, or, the thought, we were allowed to go to college, but the thought of like going on to graduate school, like becoming a doctor or lawyer, I don't know if that was really in our mindset, although eventually many of us did get graduate degrees. But I think the hard part was trying to assimilate into the into the American culture, yet constantly being told and surrounded by family who said, you're Chaldean, we want you to stay within the Chaldean culture, hopefully marry a Chaldean. And so part of me is very grateful for that, but there was also some angst growing up, because we weren't as free as other American children, but we were fully American. We were born here. When I was growing up, and this is just for the Chaldeans in general, most of the Chaldean children born in the U.S. or basically raised in the U.S. in that first pioneer group of Chaldeans, we went to Catholic schools. So like a lot of people, I started school at Blessed Sacrament Cathedral. I think a lot of people do not realize that the Cathedral of the Archdiocese of Detroit actually had an elementary school. So I went there because we used to live, I think those that are familiar with Detroit, they talk about the Edison, Boston, Chicago area with the beautiful homes. A lot of Chaldeans lived in those homes with beautiful winding staircases. We lived on Virginia Park, and families lived on Chicago Boulevard, Boston Boulevard, Edison. And so we went to Catholic schools. When I was in the 4th grade, we moved to Northwest Detroit, and I went to Jesus School, which is in the 6 Mile, Livernois area. But the American-born Chaldean children, or again, those that were educated here, almost all of them went to Catholic schools in Detroit, Visitation High School. And I remember when I was a director here giving a tour to a group of Jewish people, and I was in the Faith and Church Gallery, and they said, so by going to the going to church, you learn to speak Aramaic. You learn the Aramaic language. I mean, I learned it at home. My parents spoke to us in Chaldean. I answered in English, and they said, so your Aramaic was strengthened by going to church. And I said, actually, I learned Latin by going to church, because we were in Catholic schools, and at that time, we went to Mass every single day before school started. You know, we went as a class, we went to school, and then the third grade or fourth grade or fifth grade class went to church, and we heard Mass. So I grew up learning Latin, but we would go to the Chaldean church on Sundays. But daily Mass was actually in Latin. As a very young girl, I thought I would like to be a flight attendant. And I thought that would just be exciting, because you'd be flying all over the world. So I actually went in high school and attended a seminar on flight attendants. And one of the first things that there was a flight attendant there from Pan American Airlines, which existed at that time or something. And she said, well, you have, minimum height requirement is 5'5". So I think I just walked out of the room. I mean, there was no sense even staying there any longer. And then I thought, I was always interested in diplomacy. I was a history major in college, and I liked history, and I took a class in diplomatic history because I thought that sounded exciting. And I thought, well, one day I would like to be like the ambassador to Argentina. I mean, you just have dreams as a young child. And then when I grew up and thought, you know, I only got to go 2 miles away to college, I don't think my parents are going to let me to go to Argentina. And so I became a history teacher. I was hired in 1966. I was only 21 years old. Well, I have an October birthday. So when I actually started teaching, I was 21. But in that October, I turned 22. And I was with Warren Woods Public Schools. So a shout out to Warren Woods. And I was there for 45 years and taught history, the development of Western civilization, and loved it. Went on and got a master's degree in it's called educational leadership or school administration from Eastern Michigan University. And then eventually I went through 2 other graduate programs, one in special education and one in guidance and counseling. So for 18 years I was a high school classroom teacher, all with Warren Woods, all at the high school level. And then I worked with, in Warren Woods, my position changed, and I worked with high school special education students, talking to them about possibly going into career technical education. When I was growing up, it would have been called vocational education, but the terminology was changed to career technical education. And just working with many students, not just special education students, talking about, like, are you interested in auto mechanics or the culinary arts or drafting, auto collision repair? And did that for many years, and then continued doing that, but I also became a high school counselor. I was one of the counselors at Warren Woods Tower High School. There were a few Chaldean students in Warren Woods. The bigger district in Warren is Warren Consolidated Schools. So Warren Consolidated Schools would have had more Chaldean students than we did. But I knew the superintendent of Warren Consolidated Schools because he at one time had been Dr. Robert Livernoy, because he had been the principal at Warren Woods, eventually, and became superintendent, and then moved to Warren Consolidated. So I was aware, and he was aware that I was Chaldean, and I knew that he had many Chaldean students, so there had been some dialogue. But I think there were more like in Utica schools and from the people living in Sterling Heights. So more in Utica and Warren Consolidated, but a few in Warren Woods. But I was asked when we came across a Chaldean student, or even at the elementary level, and there was some communication problem or translation problems, verb oral. I do not read Aramaic or Arabic. Don't even pretend. And my speaking Aramaic is difficult. I understand it. I have no trouble understanding Aramaic. Speaking it can be a little bit of a challenge. But I sometimes would go to meetings for Chaldean students at the elementary or high school level if the parents didn't have any, their English was difficult. It was zero English at that point, and helped with the translation or try to communicate. And then in 2011, I retired from education and then came to work. I left Warren Woods in January of 2011, and in January of 2011, I became the executive director here at the Chaldean Cultural Center. I had been part of the founding committee since February of 2003, when we started the whole concept of the Chaldean Cultural Center. When I became the executive director, because there would be a conflict of interest, I left being on the board of directors and then became the executive director, but worked with the board of directors in creating the museum. I thought one day I would like to see where my parents were born and where my husband came from. He grew up in Baghdad. My parents were from Telkeppe. His uncle, Sharky Duda, knew my father. His uncle was here, and my husband, Zuhair Tariq Romaya, he went by the name Tariq, but his first name is really Zuhair. His uncle had talked to my dad, like Tariq was going to come to America, and would I be interested in at least meeting him? So I said, okay. So we dated and eventually got married, and he's an engineer. Well, he's deceased. He died in 2001. But he was an engineer from the University of Baghdad and worked as an engineer here when he came to America. But I have a brother-in-law. My two older sisters married two brothers, and they married into the Sarafa family. And one of my brothers-in-law is Zuhair Sarafa. He's also deceased, but anyways, his name is Zuhair. And so I was shortly, maybe just a couple of months, 3 or 4 months after I was married, I was at a party, and a Chaldean woman from Baghdad, I really did not know her, came up to me and she said, "You're married to Zuhair." And I said, "No, I'm not. That's my sister." And she said, "No, I think you're married to Zuhair." And I said, "No, I'm not. My sister is married to Zuhair." And she said, "You're married to Zuhair," and she walked away. And then, like an hour later, I thought, oh my God, I am married to Zuhair. And because my husband's first name is Zuhair. But that's not how I sort of knew him. And so I thought, oh my God, this woman is going to go back to Baghdad, tell my in-laws that your daughter-in-law does not even know who she's married to. And I thought, you know what, chalk it up. I had to learn, like at work, again, he worked for an engineering company. He went by Zuhair Romaya at work, but within the community and just socially with friends, it was Tariq. So I had to remember that if I was at an event involving his work, I was married to Zuhair. If I was anywhere else, I was married to Tariq. We just have one child. He was born in 1978. We lived in Southfield, but we were in the Birmingham School District. And so he went to Birmingham, Bingham Farms Elementary School. For high school, he went to Brother Rice. I thought I wanted to get him I really wanted him to go to a Catholic elementary school, but because I was still teaching and babysitting issues, and they didn't have all-day kindergarten like they do today, And so he went in, anyways, he went to Birmingham Public Schools. For high school, he went to Brother Rice. He then went to the University of Michigan. It was sort of, when he graduated, was a little bit sad because my husband was very ill. He wanted to go to our son's graduation, which was the end of April. It was like April 29th, somewhere April 28th or 29th of 2001 that my son graduated from college. My brother Victor and his family, I went with them to Ann Arbor at my son's graduation. My husband, unfortunately at the time, was on life support, and so he didn't see our son graduate, and then the following Friday my husband died. But Michael worked for a year in banking and then went to U of D Mercy's law school. And I wanted him to go to U of D Mercy because he wanted to be a lawyer, and that was fine with me. But I wanted to make sure he was an ethical lawyer, and I wanted that moral Jesuit background part of his law process. And also, U of D Mercy offered a joint degree. It was a 4-year program where normally law school is 3 years, where you get a law degree, you get your Juris Doctorate, and an MBA at the same time. So a lot of his elective classes were MBA courses. And so he has his law degree with an MBA. My husband was already deceased before we even created the board of directors for the Chaldean Cultural Center, which was 2003. We knew that Shenandoah was going to be built by 2003. The Chaldeans had owned the land, and they were going to build the Shenandoah Country Club. And so there was a group of us that thought that it would be nice if we had a cultural center. I think the concept of a museum was maybe in the background, but a place besides Shenandoah, like a nonprofit that would encompass the entire Chaldean community. Our culture, our arts, our history, our faith, the whole Journey to America story. When Shenandoah was being designed, and just as a matter of just disclosure, my brother Victor Sararki was the architect of Shenandoah. They gave us just over 2,000 square feet of the Shenandoah building for the Chaldean Cultural Center. So we were given the east end of Shenandoah, with the idea that maybe one day we would put a museum in here. But I want to say that the Chaldean Cultural Center is more than just the museum. The museum is our crown jewel. But we also did programming. We wanted to make sure that the Chaldean language stayed active. We had cooking classes. We had events sometimes with like Chaldean artists, similar to what the Chaldean Cultural Center and UWIAM are doing now. But we wanted the Chaldean Cultural Center to be the depository for everything Chaldean, at least everything Chaldean here in America. But again, the museum was a crown jewel. And the first director was, again, disclosure, my sister Josephine Sarafa. So there were three of us, a brother and another sister and myself, that were on the original board of directors. But it was the entire community. But we all brought, Victor as an architect, Josie was a bilingual teacher. I had been in education as a history teacher, and the position, Josephine Sarafa, my sister, retired. Avita Bacall took over, but not as director, for just a little while. And then I happened to leave teaching in January of 2011. Avita had a baby in January of 2011, so she left and I became the executive director. So while I was the director, we were just building upon, getting an awareness of the Chaldean Cultural Center, but then actively working on the building of a museum. So the hiring of architects, Ken Saylor and Dave Cirola. Saylor and Cirola are architects from New York, and their specialty was boutique museums. They're not going to build the DIA, but they'll do smaller museums. And they got us in touch with Kaya Sanan, who was a cinematographer from New York. So he did all the audio-visual, he did all of the audio and the visuals that are in the museum, the electronic visuals. Just great people to work with. And then Light Formations and a fabrication company out of Bowling Green, Ohio, and they also had offices in Cincinnati, and I think basically they're now more located in Cincinnati, and they became the fabricators for the museum. And then a lot of meetings, a lot of collaboration with New York, Ohio, and us. But then we had curators for every gallery. No one of us is an expert. I was not born in Iraq. And, I may have studied American history, but I would not have studied I wouldn't have studied intricately Mesopotamian history. I knew it because I was a history major. But the curators for the ancient gallery were Bill and Elsie Peck, who were curators at the Detroit Institute of Arts in their Ancient Near East gallery. So they were experts in the Middle East. So they helped us with the design and what should go into the ancient gallery and where we could find authentic replicas or actual authentic artifacts, and who to buy from, who were reputable dealers. For the Faith and Church Gallery, we used our own clergy. Bishop Ibrahim helped us, Bishop Francis helped us, Father Borgi helped us. For the Journey to America Gallery, where we are physically located right now, we used the Chaldeans who were born in Telkeppe. Hanashina, who was on our board of directors, Francis Borgi, who was on our board of directors, Arad Kathawa, who was on our board of directors, who were actually born and raised in Telkeppe. They may have eventually moved to Baghdad, but their family origins were from the village or from neighboring villages like El Kosh. For the Journey to America Gallery, we used ourselves because although by the time all of this is going on, 2011, 2012, 2013, our parents had died because they were born like 1900, 1910 for my father, 1922 for my mother. She only died 3 years ago. But we were in our 60s or in our 70s, late 50s, 60s, 70s years old. So we had grown up with our parents, and we worked in our father's stores. Like, as soon as we could bag groceries, we were in our father's stores working. When we were older, we were cashiers. In summers, when we weren't in high school or college, we were working at the stores. Christmas vacation, we were working at the stores. So we knew that immigrant story. We had lived it with our parents. We were young children, but as we grew older, we had lived it. And a lot of my age group took over their father's stores. Today, they may have elevated the stores like Plum Market or Market Square, but their fathers or grandfathers were grocers and then went into other occupations like law or medicine, hospitality. A lot of them own hotels, wireless, the mobile phone business, and real estate development, even wholesale foods because they could service the Chaldean stores, or Central Alarm that could provide services to the stores with the alarm systems. The message that I would leave, because my son has 3 children, and 9 and 7, identical twin girls. I want them to know their Chaldean history, but I don't want them just to know it. I mean, I want them to know where their parents came from, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, but I want them to embrace it, not just know it. I want them to be proud of their heritage. I want them to, because the best thing about being Chaldean in my mind is that we're Catholic. We have the one true faith. Not that we're the only ones saved, not by any means, but it is our means of salvation. And I want them to know and love their Catholic faith. Like, I am so happy that my grandchildren are at St. Regis Catholic School. I want that. They love our foods. I don't care if they go to a Tiger game and eat a ballpark frank. I want them to know Kubi Hameth. I want them to know Dolma, which we used to call Yuploch, which shows that I'm one of the original Chaldeans. I want them to embrace their heritage, not in any way, in no way are they to minimize the fact that they're fully American, but they are fully Chaldean. And I want them to know that, and to love it, and and I don't know what other word to use, but embrace it, that it is innate in them. And I remember that in February of 2017, Kaya Sanan, our media consultant, came here. This was basically built, and because we officially opened in September of 2017, we had a soft opening, I think in June or July, May of 2017, we had a soft opening. But it was Super Bowl weekend, so early February 2017, Kaya came from New York, and we produced that 3-minute video that's on the homepage of the Chaldean Cultural Center.org. And I had asked some Chaldeans to come because he wanted to videograph people looking at different exhibits. And he said to me, I know you know a lot of Chaldeans, just bring in some blondes, just some. So I asked some of my American teacher friends to come and bring their children who were adults and be a part. And Michael, my son Michael, was here, and so there were Chaldeans and Americans and walking around, and Kaya was videotaping various people. And then I think he had hours and hours of video and then condensed it to 3 minutes. But then we all sat and watched the video that Kaya had produced, which is in our Today gallery, so visitors to the museum will see that video. And when it was and my son watched it, and so the history of the Chaldeans, how we came to America, why Detroit, that whole story. And when it was all finished and we walked outside of the museum, my son Michael kissed me and he said, Mom, I am really proud to be a Chaldean. And I was just, oh my God, Michael, you get all my inheritance, which is easy because he's an only child, so he would. But my heart just melted. He was married, had his children, but and he now wanted to make sure his children grew up. And that's my legacy for everybody, not just for my child and grandchildren, and I want it for everyone.